Theophilia admired how time had changed for the streets of Wellington, London for the past centuries. She adored the way people spent their days during the era of Queen Victoria. She remembered how women would walk around the streets with gowns puffed up by petticoats. Nobles who held parties and invited guests for tea. She thought to herself, what would life be at a time like that? She knew she didn't fit in with today's time, but she still settled with such modern things anyways. I feel as if I was born on the wrong time, she whispered to herself. As she began to space out, she sat by a nearby bench. Then, a stranger greeted her. And why would you say that? A tall, sharply dressed man spouted at her. The man looked like a prominent gentleman. He wore a frock overcoat down with his crisp suit and dress shoes. He held a lean cane by his side. You awfully seem out of your wits on such a fine day. The mysterious man flashed a wide smile towards Theophilia. And you are? She raised her brows in question. The unknown man bowed and raised his top hat. Pardon me, for being rude, my lady. I am Alaster Ides, Field Marshal of the 66th Cavalry of Her Highness, Queen Alexandrina Victoria. Theophilia noticed the badges pinned on his overcoat. Stunned by the formal greeting, she noticed the quiet streets of Wellington were getting noisy. As she turned her head, carriages reined by horses filled the streets. Maidens walking around with parasols, and dapper men decked the sidewalk. She couldn't believe her eyes. "D.Y. My lady, are you all right? You seem to have a giggle mug all over your face." "A giggle what?" "Oh, you don't seem to be around from here." Alaster's face turned blank. "How'd you figure?" she retorted. "Well, you would have been knocked on the face with that question, and you dress, rather odd." "Hey, I'll have you KN." Theophilia was cut off by the calls of a group of men from a distance. They seemed to look disheveled. Their hair in disarray, the incomprehensible slurs coming from their mouths was enough to put Alaster in a state of panic. "Hey Alaster, where are ya, you gal sneaker?" one of them called. "Those half-rats will never let me have some peace and quiet." Alaster pinched the bridge of his nose and took Theophilia by the arm. He dragged her into a secluded or where they wouldn't seen by those blokes. A few minutes in seclusion, Alaster decided to invite Theophilia into his humble home. "Wouldn't want those idiots lollygagging at ya." Yeah, whatever that means." "Wait, where are we? And what year is it?" "That's not a socially acceptable amount of clothing in the 20th century." "Well, you're in Middlesex Street." "It's the 2nd day of March in the year 1864." Alaster stated in a delighted manner. Theophilia was shook. One moment she was walking the streets of Wellington. Next thing she knew, she was hiding in a corner of who knows where with a man who had a funny way of speaking. She reached into her bag and rummaged for her phone. Blackout is now published as a Wattpad book. As a Wattpad reader, you can access the original edition for free and the book's edition upon purchase. Ali doesn't bell. When a sudden death threatens to rip a family and an empire apart, only a precarious alliance can bring it back together. Civil disputes divide the capital. Brother turn. How am I supposed to get home? There's no reception. My dog's going to die of hunger. Now quit your yap pen. Looks like you're going to be stuck with little old me for a while. Why don't we discuss this over with some tea? Alaster's expression shifted from annoyance to pure content. He hailed a carriage and escorted her in. "How can I trust you?" Theophilia was too skeptical of trusting a stranger. "Dear, if I wanted to hurt anybody, I would have done so already." Alaster's voice turned menacing. "If that's what you are thinking about," he shifted back to his normal tone. "I'm here, because I want to help." Alaster held out his hand for Theophilia, and she decided that it was for the best. Rather than roaming around the streets clueless as mouse, she took her chances, while waiting for the ride to Alaster's home. Theophilia was uncomfortable in her seat, overwhelmed by the reality she was facing. "My lady, are you all right? You've been fumbling around with that doohickey of yours?" Alaster asked, tone filled with concern. Thophelia, that's my name, stop calling me my lady. Thophelia. That name sounds familiar. Alastor fell back into his seat. He averted his gaze towards the window upon hearing that name. He shrugged of the feeling and went on with conversing with her. It suits a bit, oh raspberry like you. So, Mr. Ides, where are we going? To Spitalfields, it's quite nearby. We'll get there in no time. Spitalfields rang a bell for Thophelia, but she couldn't point out why it bothered her. A few minutes later, the carriage took a halt. Thophelia looked through the carriage's window and was awestruck. A huge, classic two-story house appeared before her. At the front of it had a beautiful garden maze and trimmed topiaries of various animals. Alastor escorted her out of the carriage and into his home. Thophelia marveled at the sight. The furniture looked elegant and kept. She seated on the plush sofa and felt the luxury of velvet cloth through her hand. As Thophelia gawked at the living room, Alastor made his way into the kitchen to prepare some tea for his guest. It stated to turn really quiet, so she decided to call him. In the kitchen, he said in amusement. She followed the sound of his voice and stumbled in the kitchen. She sat on a nearby stool and watched him prepare their drink. Do you live here all alone? Thophelia suddenly interjected. Yes, I do quite enjoy the solemn silence and the comforts of having this house all to myself. Alastor's gaze never turned away from pouring the tea into the kettle. It's a huge house for one person. Well, it pays to be a field marshal for Her Highness. He poured them both a warm cup of tea and placed a jar of sugar cubes in front of her. She took a sip out of the tea and savored the taste. Is this chamomile? She exclaimed. Why yes, only the finest cuppa out there. Thophelia took another sip from her tea and thought of a way to get back to her time. Do you know anybody that we could consult about time traveling? She asked shyly. Alastor put a hand on his chin. I sure am no scientist, but I do know a chap. His name is Comte de Saint-Germain, a renowned philosopher and scientist. He was always a bag o' mystery. He was cut off by Thophelia standing from her stool gleaming with hope. Maybe we could ask him, he might know how to take me back. Sadly, he's already grinning at the daisy roots. Alastor's tone suddenly dropped. What do you mean by grinning at the roots? Thophelia asked, raising a brow. Ah, silly me. He's dead, he said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. Theophilia's eyes were starting to get glossy. Settle down now, I'm sure we'll think of something. Their attentions were turned by the sound of the doorbell at Alastor's front door. Who could that be? I'm not expecting anyone for the day. He stood up and lifted a hand towards Thophelia, signaling her to stay where she is. Alastor walked towards his front porch and opened the door. The greeting was cut short as Alastor slammed the door into the intruder's face. He opened the door again. Low, and slammed it yet again. He knew this guest wasn't leaving anytime soon and finally opened the door to welcome the guest. May I speak now? Thophelia was wondering why Alastor kept shutting the door. She hid deeper in the kitchen so she wouldn't be found. How long am I going to be stuck here? Days, weeks, months? Her eyes grew wide. Forever? Chestnut, my baby, who's going to feed my baby? She paced around the room and knocked a pile of papers to the ground. Picking up the pieces of fallen papers, she noticed they were a news article about a scientist named Azimuth. She quickly grabbed the article. Footsteps were heard coming towards the kitchen, so she quickly stacked the papers in an even layer. Who was that? Wait, never mind, how about this? She shows the article, Azimuth guy, he might help me, he seems to know something about time traveling. Well, you're in luck, that was my old chap, Philip Ainsworth, also known as Azimuth, and I think he could be of assistance to you. You see, he's holding a little gathering and inviting one of the nobles. Philip's also a scientist, if not probably the predecessors of Comte de Saint-Germain. One thing I just don't stand in Philip, he can be quite balmy on the crumpet, Looney, am I saying it right? Alastor nervously stated. I'll take my chances, let's go. Though Ophelia started gathering her things and was walking towards the front door, only to be stopped by Alastair's chuckles. You sure are a bricky girl. You'd make a stuffed bird laugh with what you're wearing. And don't get too giddy. The gathering is in 3 days' time. Plenty of time for us to go out and look for something appropriate to use. He finishes. 3 days. Where would I live? My money's not enough to last me a day. Though Ophelia started to panic. Why, with me of course, what kind of gentleman would let a lady sleep on the streets? Are you sure? I don't want to bother you. Would you rather have me take you outside when it goes dark, out where criminals feed on the innocent? His tone turned dark. No. I'll stay here. Ha 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 ha, wise choice. I could use the company as well, it can get really lonely in this house. It was starting to get dark outside. The 2 inhabitants of the Ides household were enjoying a hearty dinner prepared by Alastair himself. Served on the table were flavorful soup, roasted turkey with dressing alongside potatoes and rice. Some fresh dinner rolls with sweet cream butter, jams, jellies and sweet pickles. Wow! You made all of these? Though Ophelia seated herself by the dinner table. I'm glad you like it. It's quite nice to cook a handful every once in a while. The 2 conversed while eating. It's such a huge house, don't you have a wife or something? Though Ophelia questioned, her mouth stuffed with mashed potatoes. Alastair's eyes went wide. His collar suddenly hugged his neck tightly. He adjusted it and went back to his original demeanor. I used to have someone around, sadly they are no longer around though. Though Ophelia was quite angry at herself for asking. She didn't want to make him uncomfortable, she was already grateful for his hospitality and didn't want to ruin it. Sorry. Though Ophelia felt herself grew smaller in her chair. It's all right, I'd rather not talk about right now. Don't feel down. How about you? Do you have someone you live with in your time? He asked amused. I have Chestnut, with me. Though Ophelia said, reverting back with smile and a glimmer in her eye. What kind of name is Chestnut? Alastair tilted his head in question. He's the fluffiest and sweetest dog. He has the cutest of noses, and she cut herself knowing she was losing her manners. A dog living with you? We usually have those tied up in a cage. He sounds lovely. Alastair said, smiling. Theophilia's eyes were gleaming even more. They chatted and talked about the most mundane of things till Alastair noticed it was getting late. She helped him in tidying up the table. She also offered to wash the plates but was halted by Alastair. He said that guests shouldn't be doing housework. He ushered her towards the loo and told her to wash up and get ready for the night. I don't have any clothes suited for you, all I have is these oversized pajamas of mine. That's all right, I do like loose clothes. Alastair handed the clothes and told her where she would sleep. He pointed towards his guest room and told her not to wait up for him. Though Ophelia finished and looked for the room Alastair provided. The room was wonderful. It had a king-size bed with a huge canopy, a dresser with a mirror and a balcony opening towards the garden. She sat on the plush bed and felt it sink underneath her. She lied down and contemplated on how she would get home. Sleep eventually overcame her and she drifted off into a peaceful slumber. Next day. The smell of hot coffee and breakfast awoke Ophelia. She realized that yesterday was no dream. She stood up and rolled the loose pajamas and followed the smell of bacon and eggs. Good morning to you. Alastair greeted. She yawned and stretched. Good morning to you too. Are those waffles? Some egg fritters, crumpets, and a pot of steaming hot coffee. Enjoy. Alastair placed the plates on the table. Ophelia stifled a laugh. When she saw what Alastair was wearing. He had on a ridiculously bright pink apron lined with brightly colored ribbons. You look funny. It takes one to know one, dear, he said in a smirk. Touché. She agreed and sat down. So, are you doing anything today? She asked. Well, I do have the week off. How about we go out and look for something to wear? He said excitedly. I thought you said people would throw looks at what I was wearing. Not with a long coat over, he stated. The two finished their breakfast and got ready to go out into the streets of Spitalfields. They waited for a carriage and set off into Whitechapel City. Though Ophelia marveled yet again on how beautiful London was in the past. The sidewalks were filled with busy people. The carriage came to halt. They both got off and stopped by a store. They were greeted by the shop's clerk. Welcome to Alphea's, home of the finest clothes in London. Alastair, lovely to see you again. The owner was a middle-aged woman around her 30s. She wore an elegant long-sleeve jacket and a long skirt lined with ruffles. Alastair raised his top hat and greeted her. Anna, lovely to see you too, a dress that would suit her, please. He pointed towards the Ophelia. Oh. Is she your lady friend? Anna asked excitedly. Yes, she's a friend from work. Alastair smiled uneasily. Oh, whatever you say. Come here, darling, we'll take you measurements. Anna led the Ophelia into a fitting room. How about you, Alastair? Do you need anything? Shall I take your measurements too? Anna questioned. No fuss, I'll have a look around, see anything I like. Anna took the proper measurements for the Ophelia. They both chatted and talked about themselves. The Ophelia carefully keeping the conversation light. All right, it's all done. You'll have you dressed by the day after. The Ophelia quickly asked Anna how much the dress was. She almost fainted from the cost. She quickly sought out for Alastair. Alastair, I can't afford such a dress, she exclaimed. Don't worry, it's all on me. He assured. I can't let you spend all that money on someone you just met. Nonsense. It feels like I've known you for so long with what we did last night. He beamed. Anna heard the twos quarreling and started blushing from the words that came out of Alastair's mouth. Alrighty then, the two of you can discuss your little fiascos at home, not in my shop. Alastair, I thought you knew better. Anna pointed a finger at Alastair. No, miss, you're getting the wrong idea dash. Ah, no need to point it out, just accept the gift. I can see Alastair trusts you enough to buy you a dress. Now run along and enjoy the day. Anna escorted the two out her shop. I'll have it delivered in by the day after tomorrow. Thank you again. Anna Alastair bid his farewell. The look on your face, you seem poked up, he teased. Theohelia sighed and started walking away from Alastair. Why is he so difficult? She suddenly heard the clanging of a bell around the sidewalk. Read all about it. Read all about it. Murderer of Whitechapel Street strikes again. Read all about it, shouted a boy swinging his bells in the air. The boy was wearing tattered clothes that looked like it had seen better days. Beside him were piles of newspapers. She approached the boy and asked him how much were the newspapers. 3 shillings, my lady, he said with a smile. She noticed how the boy was struggling to sell them, he was tired, and his voice was parched. She bent down to his level and reached for her wallet and noticed she only had £10 left. She grabbed the boy's hands and placed the £10 bill on his palm. My lady, I don't have enough money to pay you back, the boy told her in dismay. Keep it, it's yours. You earned it. Though Ophelia smiled back. Stunned by her actions, the boy hugged her in the process. She hugged him back and took a newspaper. They both waved goodbye towards each other. As she read the article, she grew mortified by the picture of a mutilated man. A murderer was roaming the very streets she walked on. Her breath hitched as she began to hyperventilate. Looking around, she was suddenly scared of the people around her. She was undergoing a panic attack. She suddenly met the cold, brick-hard ground. The last thing she saw was a silhouette picking her from the ground. Ophelia woke up in a cold sweat. I see you're awake. Ophelia turned to the sound of Alastair. He was seated near the bed holding what appears to be the newspaper she bought. The devil can't be draftedly caught, he said in annoyance. Ophelia stood up and went limp. Alastair caught her in a swift motion and put her back into the bed. A murderer's running loose around Whitechapel. Tears were streaming down her distressed face. Settle down, here have some water, he handed her a glass of water. Whoever she is, it's no ordinary murderer, I've read the article. The bodies were so grotesque, I could hardly look. She began breathing unsteadily. Alastair noticed she was panicking again, he wiped her tears and caressed her head. I'm sure the authorities are doing their best sniffing the dickens out of this monster, he assured. Go back to sleep, Ophelia. I don't think I can, she kept a blank stare. Well, then I guess I'll have to stay here then, he sat down and read the newspaper he set aside. You don't need to, I'll read a book or something, she laid down. The room was crowded in silence. The turning of pages was the only sound Ophelia heard. What do you usually do in social gatherings? She asked out of nowhere. Well, you socialize, have a drink or 2 or 10, Alastair replied, his eyes never leaving the papers. Other than that, have you been on any social gatherings yourself? Tons, I've been through tons of those. Each duller than the other. What was the best gathering you attended? Ophelia perked up and sat on the bed. Intrigued by the question, Alastair set the newspaper he was reading on the bedside table. The Queen's dinner party. It was grandeur. We waltzed till the evening and toasted to our victories, he said in glee. You must have had a blast, she yawned. I wish I knew how to waltz. Heavens! You do not know how to waltz? Alastair put a hand on his heart. Well, we're not exactly the type to dance on any occasions no more. Alastair noticed she was slowly drifting to sleep. Tomorrow, I shall teach you the proper manners during a gathering and how to waltz. Ophelia was fast asleep already. He tucked her nice and good and shut the lights. Next day, she awoke from her slumber and was greeted by the soft sounds of orchestra music. She got out of bed and followed the sound. It came from a record player playing the Blue Danube Waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. She saw a waltzing Alastair in the living room. Good morning, dear. Eat your breakfast and I shall show you how to waltz. He ushered her towards the kitchen. Alastair, I know I can't pay you back, I'd like to say thank you for all you've done for me. She smiled as she took a seat next to the dining table. No need to worry. You'll come around. Now eat, eat, eat. He placed a bowl of soup in front of her and she ate her fill. Repeat after me, he showed her the proper footwork. Like this? Ophelia followed awkwardly. That's it, you're getting there. Hey, this is actually kind of food. Ophelia was betrayed by her own footsteps. Accepting the cold hard floor, she stopped by just an inch. Alastair swooped the back of her waist and held her in a dip. Focus, he said teasingly. He, yeah. She laughed nervously. You seem to be enjoying yourself, why don't we try a new routine? He placed her hand on his shoulder and positioned his hand on her waist. He gradually guided her, careful enough not to let her step on his shoe. The two eventually came to a stop. Alastair urgently needed to leave he was called in for a meeting. Ophelia never remembered having that much fun. She was so high on dancing she almost forgot all her problems. She eventually assured Alastair she would be fine to be left alone at home. She would stroll the safe side of the streets in case she needed fresh air. I'll be home around 7 in the evening. Farewell. He went on his way and hailed a carriage. As Ophelia wandered and admired the house for almost an hour or two, she eventually took the stroll down into Spitalfields. She thought a walk would do to pass the time while Alastair wasn't around. Preoccupied by the bypassers, she bumped into someone. "Sorry. I wasn't looking on where I was going," she bowed. "It's all right, my lady. I was just doing my rounds." The person she bumped into was a police officer. "I'm here to spread the word." "Word? What word?" she questioned. "It's about the murderer on Whitechapel Street." Though Ophelia grew pale. "Wah, what about the murderer?" "He's dubbed as the Whitechapel Ripper. He mercilessly mutilates his victims. His intentions are still unknown. Recent reports lead to him roaming around Spitalfields." Though Ophelia had enough of what the officer was saying. She dashes back into Alastair's house and locked every crevice lockable. She hid in the room Alastair accommodated her in. She hid herself underneath the blankets, as if it would shield her from her impending doom. It was already past 7 and Alastair was still not home. Though Ophelia inspected the living room, blankets still on her shoulders. Then she heard clicking noises coming from the door. It could possibly be Alastair. She carefully approached the door and peeked through the peeping hole. She saw a black figure carrying what seems to be a weapon. She quickly backed away and checked if the back doors were bolted. The clicking noises from the front door stopped but moved towards the back. She saw that she did lock the door and ran terrified into her room and locked the door. She knew she had to keep quiet, but her nervousness wasn't helping her. Her heart stopped, she forgot the balcony doors. The doors clicked open and she heard footsteps approaching her. Accepting her immediate death, a hand made its way on her shoulders. Meeting her killer, she screamed for her dear life. A hand also made its way into her mouth to shut her up. "Why did you lock me out of my own house?" Alastair questioned her. Though Ophelia felt relief rush over her. Alastair removed his hand from her mouth to let her explain. "I was out and the police officer told me the murderer was spotted roaming around Spitalfields. I ran back here as fast as I could and panicked. You were still not home, but then the knobs clicked and I thought it was you, but it wasn't." She kept repeating a few words out of shock. "It can't be helped, we have to take extra caution now. Tomorrow you'll company to get your dress, after that we'll head straight to Philip's." He patted her head. "Come on, let's have dinner." They both ate their dinner in silence. As the two were freshening up for sleep, Theopelia asked where had Alastair gone. "I was arranging some things on the court. There were some delays. I'm sorry I took long," he said. "I'm sorry I panicked," though Ophelia said. Alastair laughed at her remark and the two bid their goodbyes. The gathering. Though Ophelia woke, it was the day she would finally get her questions answered. "Will I get home, or will I stay here forever?" She laid on the bed for about 10 minutes, till she heard Alastair's calls. "Eat up, it's a big day today," Alastair told her in delight. Though Ophelia noticed that there were more served foods than typical. She sat where she was usually seated. Some baked potatoes drizzled in butter, eggs seasoned with parsley, freshly brewed coffee and some toast. Theophilia's appetite wasn't stirring as she thought of the events last night. "These all look amazing. I'm just not up in the mood for it." She slouched back into her chair. "At least eat something. Wouldn't want you to faint again," Alastair said, tone filled with concern. "How about you fill your plate for just a bit and I'll slice you a piece of chocolate cake?" He swayed. "Thanks, but no, I'm just really knocked up," she denied his offer. "Huh, and I though nobody said no to cake." "You must be that knocked up. Here, eat what you can and have some rest. I'll come to your room and tell you to prepare when we leave." Though Ophelia ate what her stomach would accept and headed into her room. Her thoughts were getting the best of her as she laid on the bed. She forcibly shut her eyes to rest. A few hours later, Alastair knocked on her door and told her it was time to go. She groggily walked towards the loo and did her best to look presentable. After that they left the house and went into town to get ready for the party. They stopped back at the shop they went in a few days ago. "Good day you too, miss. Follow me and I'll lead you to your dressing room," Anna, the shopkeeper said. "Alastair, your suit is pressed at the room over there." "Thank you, Anna." Checks on the counter. The two head into their respective changing rooms. A few minutes later, Alastair came out first. He changed into a dinner suit with a long frock coat and bow tie. He smoothed out his hair in front of the mirror and waited for Ophelia to finish. It took a few more minutes for Ophelia to appear. As the curtains were drawn back, she stepped out of the changing room. She wore a long blue satin gown. The petticoat made her dress puff out and the corset made her waist a lot narrower. Her hair was in an updo, courtesy of Anna. To finish her look, she had a black laced shawl. "You look splendid," Alastair exclaimed. Ophelia blushed at the comment. "It's kind of hard to move with all these layers, but I think I can manage," she said while adjusting to her heeled shoes. "Alrighty then, I can see how much you adore each other." "Ehem. I mean the way you present yourselves." Anna stepped to the side. Alastair sent her a knowing look and wink. "Thank you, again, Anna. We'll get on our way now." He bid her goodbye. As did Ophelia. She took Anna's hand in hers and said her praises and thanks. They both took a carriage heading to St. James Palace. The ride was a bit long since it was at the ends of Whitechapel. Alastair raised his arm to better escort Ophelia. She took his arm and held on to him. Ophelia was enthralled by the halls of the palace. It was huge. It had a banquet table at the far end. The ceiling shone as glass chandeliers reflected the lights. "Looks like we're on time." Alastair handed the invitations towards the one of the table men and made their way to the hall. Alastair suddenly bowed in front of Ophelia. She was confused by his sudden actions. Till she observed her surroundings and understood his intentions. She curtsied and took the hand Alastair offered. "Do you remember what I've taught you?" he asked. "Clear as day," she said. As the music started, all the guests, including Alastair and Ophelia, started waltzing. It felt like time had stopped for Ophelia. They danced throughout the night and she had a blast. The music was dying out and all the inhabitants curtsied and bowed. They started crowding in the center of the hall to witness the speaker of tonight's event. Philip Ainsworth finished his short speech and disappeared. The people around Ophelia started socializing, leaving her all alone. She turned around to look for Alastair. He too was engaged in a conversation with his fellow elites. Avoiding to further burden Alastair with her objective, she set out to look for Philip. She searched every place in the hall. She even mustered the courage to ask a complete stranger of his whereabouts. As she explored the palace, she came face to face to a door leading outside the palace. She opened the door and looked around for Philip, but he was now here to be seen. She suddenly saw a silhouette pacing around the side of a skip. Evading to be noticed, she hid herself, leaving only a portion of her face to be noticed. Horrified of what she has just witnessed, she clasped her hands around her mouth to stop the noise from coming out. Two bodies were seen in the skip, one lying in a pool of his own blood. One clutching a knife and possessing a familiar face. Ophelia ran back into the palace. She shook the door handles to hard and made a ruckus. "Looks like I was spotted," said the man clutching the knife. Ophelia didn't notice that there was another frame hidden beneath the shadows. "I'll take care of it," the mysterious figure said. Running as if her life depended on it, which it really did, she searched for Alastair. She came into the hall and felt a hand touch her shoulder. "Where have you been?" "I've been looking for you all night," he said. "Philip," she said in between sobs. "Philip's the Whitechapel Ripper. We have to get out of here." Alastair calmed her down by hugging her close. Ophelia was weary of her surroundings. She was gonna pass out again. The only thing she felt was a sharp pain in her side and blacked out. Though Ophelia sluggishly opened her eyes, she felt like her legs and arms were bound to something. She quickly adjusted her sight and noticed she was tied to a chair, a white cloth preventing her from speaking. "Looks like someone's awake." Though Ophelia averted her attention towards the voice. She sat wide-eyed. "I was going to finish you then and there, but where's the fun in that? Why are you doing this?" Though Ophelia cried in her thoughts. "You saw someone in that skip. I couldn't let you run around with what you just saw," he said, as if he had read her thoughts. Alastair leaned back into his chair. "And you know why I did that? Well, listen carefully. 20 years ago, I was at death's doorstep. I knew I had nothing to live for anymore. Then she came, my lovely Ophelia, so pure and sweet. She was kind and giving to others, she helped a damned soul like me. So, I did everything to court her. Her parents didn't approve of me, but she knew what she was getting into. We eloped and settled in the slums of Whitechapel. We were expecting, and I knew I had to get a proper job to support the three of us. A war broke out and needed men to fight. I was desperate for a job. If I enlisted, my own child wouldn't know who I am, but if I didn't, our child would die. I told her I would find a job and would enlist. She told me it was a great idea, but she also knew I may not come back alive. In the end, I knew I had to come up with a decision." Alastair clasped his hands together and placed his elbows on his knees. His eyes grew dark in the process. "I bid the two of them my goodbyes and vowed I would return in one piece. I came home in an empty house. I couldn't find her anywhere. And that's when I knew those vile heathens took her away from me. I sought revenge and climbed through the ranks. Once I knew that I was at the top, I'd get rid of every single one of them. Anybody standing in my way faced my wrath." He shouted towards the Ophelia. She flinched in the process as tears streamed down her face. He regained his normal composure. Standing up, he bent down to meet the Ophelia face to face. "Such a shame, you would have taken her place. You both look splendidly alike. Alas, I cannot let you see the light of day with what you know." She fell towards the side and felt blood pour around, her eyes were slowly drained of life. Her body nothing but an empty shell on the floor. Jolting from the hospital bed, Theophilia breathed heavily. She noticed she was in a white room with an IV attached to the back of her hand. A nurse came in and saw that she was already awake. "Miss, please do not strain yourself." The nurse walked towards her. "What year is it?" the Ophelia asked as she held her head. "It's the 19th of August, 2020, replied the nurse. The nurse thought it was an absurd question but decided not to judge. "Miss, you were lying on a bench, passed out, and not breathing. Your husband quickly rushed you here. If it weren't for him, there would have been complications." "Husband? I'm not married," the Ophelia thought. "He's right outside. We usually don't let relatives in the room while the patient's out cold. I'll go get him." The nurse exited her room. The Ophelia was wondering who this relative was. She didn't have any family members living in London. And a husband, she barely had a significant other. She absorbed her surroundings, taking in the fact that it was all a nightmare. She was in the future, none of those things happened. The door clicked open, the visitor came in with his back facing her. She saw him carrying a bouquet of flowers. "I'm sorry, but she stopped mid-sentence when her said husband turned around. "How are you feeling, love?" Standing in front of her was none other than Alastair. Instead of wearing an old 18th century suit and overcoat, he wore dark jeans and white long-sleeved shirt. Though Ophelia was stunned, she thought she would never see him again. Calling for help, she tried to shout at the top of her lungs. She failed to do so as Alastair swiftly pounced on her bed, cupping her mouth, and holding her in place between his legs. "Shhhhhh. I thought the nurse told you not to strain yourself," he smiled wickedly. Though Ophelia violently thrashed under his weight to break free. Her voice was muffled, leaving her helpless. Alastair leaned in. "Don't worry, love, I'll take good care of you, but for now, it's lights out for you. Darkness enveloped her vision.